Good day, young philosophers. In our last video, we were just reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, Chapter 1, and here we were looking at voluntary actions and trying to figure out when we're responsible for an action, what voluntary actions are. And we said that ultimately that an action is voluntary if it's not involuntary. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, if the action wasn't forced, in other words, if the principle of action is in the agent, him or herself, and then also if the action is not a result of some kind of ignorance, right? And so, okay. That being the case, then we talked about forced and we talked about mixed actions and what kinds of things kind of seem like being forced but aren't really forced. We're going to do something similar when we're talking about ignorance now. Like, what really is ignorance in human action, right? And do all kinds of ignorance make an act involuntary? So let's think about this, right? Are all actions caused by ignorance involuntary? To help us understand that, we're going to see one of the first distinctions that Aristotle makes when thinking about knowledge in human action between what he calls the non-voluntary and involuntary acts because of ignorance. And again, to make even that distinction, let's start with a little story. Let's start with an example. Let's say here. Say Joe owns a MacBook Pro, and just before leaving the library, he sees his computer sitting on the table and carries it out, right? Upon returning back to his room, though, he discovers that his own laptop was already packed in his bag. The MacBook he grabbed on the way out was not his, so I guess apparently he has two MacBooks right now, right? So the real question first for me is like, what would you do? If you just were coming out of the library and you accidentally grabbed an extra MacBook and it wasn't yours, like what would you do? What would be the right thing to do? I'm hoping maybe you'd try to go back and return it or something like that. But what did Joe do? Joe decided to keep both. And so my question for you is this action blameworthy or pardonable? Is it blameworthy or pardonable? Should I pardon him and be like, oh, well, even though you thought that this other MacBook was yours, and so funny mistake. I guess we're not gonna blame you for that. Or should we blame him? Right? Well, if he decides to keep both, I think that his action is blameworthy. I think he did the wrong thing. Right? What would have been pardonable is if, upon realizing his error, right, he went. In my opinion, if he went back to the library, to the library, and he tried to return it, right? The library to return the thing. But without returning it, I think I would blame him, right? And so that's an important kind of distinction. Aristotle would say that an action only becomes involuntary, right, because of kind of ignorance, if there was some type of regret, right, and maybe some type of pain involved with it, right? So theoretically, Joe, when he decides to keep both, he doesn't regret what happened. He kind of maybe even takes some joy in it. There's no pain. So for him, it's a kind of non-voluntary action. But this is not a good thing. This is a bad thing. This being non-voluntary means he didn't necessarily realize what he was doing when he did it. He didn't intend to essentially steal someone else's laptop. But in the end, that's kind of what ended up happening. It wasn't really an involuntary act, right? And part of us understanding this distinction between non-voluntary and involuntary acts is related to thinking even more deeply about human action in general, and that's the difference between universal and particular knowledge, right? Universal and particular knowledge in human action. And we'll just decide to explain what the difference is between these two things here in just a minute. But when we think about this situation, what was this person necessarily lacking in? Well, depending on the kind of choices they make, they might be lacking in just universal knowledge, or they might be lacking in just particular knowledge, or maybe both, right? So Aristotle will say this, though. Ignorance of blank is blameworthy, by ignorance of the other is pitiable or pardonable. Well, Aristotle is going to say ignorance of the universal. If you don't know something universal, it's going to be blameworthy. While ignorance of the particular is maybe not always pitiable or pardonable, but it's definitely the kind of thing that could be pitied or pardoned, right? And so, when we think about this person, right, we still need to get a better distinction on what we mean by these two types of knowledge. And so, actually, again, to even give us better insight, let's think about what we'll call in Aristotle the practical syllogism, and we'll see very clearly in this kind of line of reasoning where the universal is and where the particular. So in the practical syllogism, I can't speak today. It's like a kind of argument that ends in an action, right? It's an argument whose conclusion, right? Whose conclusion is an action, right? It's not just an idea. It's not just a thought. The conclusion is the person acting itself. And that says conclusion in case you can't read it. I'm sorry, I got to write more slowly. So here's two sort of competing practical syllogisms, right? You could say like sweet things are pleasant. This cake is sweet. And the conclusion is all of a sudden I just start eating cake, right? This isn't just like the sentence I eat cake. It's like me actually eating the cake, right? And similarly, in a competing practical syllogism, fattening foods are harmful to me. This cake is fattening. And so what do? I turn away from the cake, right? And so what's the idea here? Well, each of these two statements here, the first and the second, are a kind of premise to an argument. They're a kind of premise. They're a kind of reason that we give that influences what we think or what we do, right? And so which of these is the universal, of these two here and of these two here, which is the universal premise, right? Which is the universal statement? Well, the universal statement is the first statement. This is the kind of universal, that sweet things are pleasant. This cake is sweet is a statement of a particular. It's an observation I make about this thing in front of me, right? But similarly here, saying fattening foods are harmful to me, that's a universal statement. And this cake is fattening, that's a particular statement, right? It's something about something in my circumstance right here, right? And so when we're talking about the universal and the particular, when Aristotle says that it's the universal that, ignorance of the universal that's blameworthy, while ignorance of the particular that can be pitiable, Aristotle will say, when he talks about ignorance of the universal, he's really talking about what we ought to do, right? And so that's what Aristotle means by universal knowledge. It has to do with our ends. It has to do with what we ought to do and the kinds of actions that we recognize are good. Now notice that in these two universal statements, these two universal premises that I presented here already, that they both related to something that we talked about last class, which was about what was fundamentally good. Notice the words sweet things are pleasant and fattening foods are harmful to me. Remember that those were two statements that had to do with what was naturally good. In fact, not just what kinds of actions are good, but of course we could say what kind of actions are inherently bad, right? And we talked about the things that are sort of good by nature, good by, I like this black marker. It writes more neatly than some of the others. Maybe it's just me, I don't know. But what's good by nature, right? And so what were some of the things that were good by nature? Well, I'm not going to rewrite them here, but it was what was beneficial, what was pleasant, and what was beautiful, right? What was bad by nature? Well, things that were harmful, things that were painful, and things that were just ugly, right? And we talked about that last class. And so those kinds of things, the understanding what kinds of actions we ought to do, what kinds of things are ultimately good or bad, this is universal statement. So you ought to eat things that are sweet. Why? Because by nature, you desire things that are sweet. And you ought to avoid things that are harmful. By nature, we know we should avoid things that are harmful. Ignorance about these kinds of things is the kind of ignorance that is blameworthy, ultimately. And so, well, what's the other things? These other statements are practical knowledge, right? And these ultimately have to do with the circumstances surrounding our actions. It's how we perceive the situation in which we're acting, the who, what, when, where, and how, right? And so when I look at this cake, how do I perceive the cake? In both cases, there's cake in front of me. But how am I perceiving it at this moment? Well, my particular knowledge, I could either perceive it as sweet or I could perceive it as fattening. And how I look at it, right? When I perceive it as sweet, and it draws me towards it because I know that's the kind of thing I want. But when I perceive it as fattening, it makes me unhappy because it's something that I should avoid, right? Theoretically, if I'm the kind of person that should avoid fattening foods, right? And so this is this kind of tension that can come through in terms of particulars. So what's important for us is to think about what kinds of knowledge are going on at the same time. Do we fully understand the universals or do we fully understand the particulars? Remember that when Aristotle defined voluntary action at the end of book 3, chapter 1, which we actually had read in the beginning of our previous video, Aristotle said voluntary action seems to be what has its principle in the agent himself, knowing the particulars that constitute the action. In particular, what makes an action voluntary is the particulars. In fact, Aristotle will assume that everyone basically already knows the universals, because failure to know a universal, right? A failure here, failure for Aristotle in terms of a universal is a sign of what he'll call a vicious character, right? That makes, in other words, a person can be a kind of vicious person if they fail to understand the proper universals. What do we mean by that, right? Well, let's read the text and I'll explain a little bit what we mean by that. Let's see here in in Book 3, Chapter 1, a lot here in Book 3, Chapter 1. If we look here around Section 14, Aristotle will say that certainly every vicious person is ignorant of the actions he must do or avoid. Right? And this sort of error makes people unjust and in general bad, right? So there's some kind of ignorance. When we said, do all kinds of ignorance make an action involuntary? Aristotle will say, no. If you're ignorant of universals, it makes you a bad person, right? And what would that even mean? What do you mean ignorance of a universal? Well, let's think of a similar situation to this, Joe in the MacBook, right? Let's say that instead of this situation where Joe mistakenly had taken someone else's MacBook, let's say he purposefully, right, took another's laptop, right? Took another's laptop computer, right? That is a kind of ignorance of this is a sign of vice, and we'll talk more about vice in the second half of our class this week. But this is a sign of vice. It's a kind of ignorance about what we ought to do. It's an ignorance about the nature of property and taking what's yours, and ultimately, it's an ignorance about stealing, right? Someone who thinks ultimately that stealing is the good thing to do, is the right thing to do, that they think that stealing is something that you ought to do, then that's a kind of person who's vicious, and that is not something that would make an action involuntary. In fact, it's voluntary and blameworthy, right? So what kind of knowledge would, and actually, let me even go back to this example too. You might even argue that Joe, in this exact situation, because he decided to keep both, because he didn't decide to look for someone else, he probably also has the same vicious character, right? And what do I think that he still has the same vicious character? Well, even though it was non-voluntary in the sense that he didn't realize what he was doing at the time, he had no regret, he had no pain, and because there was no regret and no pain, it's like he would have done it anyways, right? So this lack of regret and pain is like it's something that you would have done, would have done anyways, right? It's something that you would have done anyways, almost like, ooh, and I'm so glad that I got away with it. I didn't even realize what I was doing at the time, but the lack of regret and pain is this affirmation that I'm the kind of person who would like to steal laptops, and perhaps I normally wouldn't do it because I'm afraid of getting caught, but look at this, I just got away with it, didn't even realize what I was doing. Isn't this great? That is just as much vice as someone who would purposefully go, in many senses, to try to steal something. And that, again, is not involuntary. It is a voluntary act, and it is blameworthy. So again, what about the particular? Well, if someone, as soon as they realized what they did in this situation, they tried to return the laptop, then that would be pardonable, right? Why? Because their error was not in a universal about what they ought to do. It was in a circumstance. They didn't perceive the situation correctly. They perceived it as them accidentally almost leaving their computer, when in fact it was really someone else's. So when we're talking about these particulars, we're talking about our grasp of who, what, when, where, how, and things like that. One thing just to point out, what's missing from this list? The why. Why? Because the why actually belongs here. The why is always why we do our actions. And so, there are some ways that you might think of the whys as we try to understand why some other person might have done what they did. But ultimately, fundamentally, the why belongs here to us thinking about our ends and our goals. Remember, what was the Greek word for ends? Telos, right? Thinking about the sort of telos of our actions and the purpose, and the particular purposes that we have for what we do. So Aristotle talks about circumstances here in some more detail, and the universal in particular. Let's read here. He says, ignorance of what is beneficial is not taken to make action involuntary. That's like ignorance of what we ought to do. Remember, the beneficial was one of the things that were good by nature, right? It says that ignorance of the universal is a cause for blame, rather the cause of ignorance of the particulars which the action consists and is concerned with, since these allow both pity and pardon. For an agent acts involuntarily if he is ignorant of one of these particulars. So it's ignorance of particulars that makes an action involuntary. So here Aristotle goes on and lists some general examples, right? He says, presumably then, it is not a bad idea to define these particulars and say what they are and how many. And so he just starts listing them. He says, they are who is doing it, what he is doing, about what or to who he is doing it, sometimes also what he is doing it with what instrument, for example, and for what results? Safety, for example, in what way? Gently or hard, example. Like all these things. So Aristotle basically says it's the who, what, when, where, and how, not necessarily the why, but who, what, when, where, and how that is the circumstances surrounding an action, right? He actually gives some other kinds of stories too of situations where someone acted out of some kind of ignorance of particulars. And now this doesn't necessarily mean that they're always involuntary in these circumstances, because sometimes there's a situation where even though you were ignorant of a particular, you should have been paying closer attention, right? Sometimes we'll see that someone might actually be negligent. And so it's not the case that even all kinds of ignorance of particulars would be allowable as the kind of thing that would keep someone from being blamed for an action. Sometimes if we're negligent in even trying to grasp the circumstances, then that can be blameworthy. But in some sense, our negligence it ultimately might come out of a misunderstanding about what we ought to do. Again, if you're a negligent person, then you're actually lacking in some kind of principle of a universal, right? You're not knowing that you need to pay attention. You need to pay attention. Like for instance, there's all kinds of circumstances you might think of when you should have been paying attention. I might yell at my kids, like, even though you said you didn't realize what you're doing, you should have known better. I raised you better than that. I raised you to pay attention. I taught you to pay attention to these circumstances. In an extreme case, you might think of a doctor, right? Say a doctor, right? What's the first thing that happens when you go to a doctor's office? The doctor asks you for your medical history, and it's not even just the doctor. The first thing you do is you fill out a bunch of forms, and then a nurse usually comes and asks you to all the same questions, and then the doctor even usually asks the questions again. Why? Because they have this obligation to not be negligent. They want to know all the particular circumstances. Aristotle talks about even doctors here, and as he lists what I would call some more specific kinds of examples, not just generally saying who, what, when, where, and how, but he gets a little bit more specific with some examples. So let's read. He talks about here, say someone accidentally gave up a secret and not realizing that they were forbidden to reveal it. So they didn't realize that they weren't supposed to tell anyone. This just happened to me the other day when my kids had actually, it was funny. They had a little day off. We homeschool our kids anyways, but we've been homeschooling with the coronavirus anyways. And one of my kids came up and told me that they didn't have to do schoolwork that day. And then one of their siblings got mad at them because it was supposed to be a secret. It was kind of funny. And it really wasn't. And so that one of my when her brother was yelled at her for telling me she didn't realize it was supposed to be a secret. It was kind of funny. So, but I was glad she told me. I wanted to know. It just meant we had a more fun day doing some other stuff. But anyways. Or he talks about other situations that are kind of like ignorance of examples. He says a person with a catapult that let it go when he only wanted to demonstrate it, right? Something like that. Again, he might think that his son is an enemy, as Merope did. I don't know who that is, but like you might think your son is the enemy and you accidentally attack your son, or that a barbed spear has a button on it. In other words, like a spear that's got like maybe like a cork or something like that to make it less safe, right? Or giving someone a drink to save his life, we might kill him. Well, that's like the example of a doctor, right? A doctor who tries to give safe, life-saving medicine. Like, for instance, my son, Dominic, is allergic to penicillin, and we need the doctors to know that because penicillin is a great drug that will help in most circumstances. But if a doctor didn't realize that my son was allergic to it, it could really hurt him. And so that's the kind of thing that is actually a matter of circumstances that would be pardonable if the doctor did everything the doctor could in their power to get our medical history, but somehow still didn't get an accurate one. Then you might not blame them. But if the doctor simply didn't ask and prescribe the medicine anyways, then maybe the doctor has some culpability in that kind of situation, right? And just another example, Aristotle says, and wanting to touch someone as they do in sparring, we might wound him. Right? So if you're like play fighting, but you accidentally hurt someone, that could be a kind of issue. And that's all analogous to ignorance of the circumstance. So when Aristotle talks about are all actions caused by ignorance involuntary? Answer, no, right? First of all, the only kinds of things that could potentially be involuntary is when you have a failure of knowledge of circumstances. If you don't know the universals, if you don't know that it's wrong to steal from another person, Aristotle will not say that that's okay. He's going to say that's blameworthy, right? If you fail to know a circumstance, well, for the most part, that might get you off the hook unless your lack of knowledge of that was due to negligence, which is also showing a deeper flaw in your character about what you ought to do. So, friends, this concludes this first part of class. The next part of our course, we're going to really dig into actually the similar distinction, but helping us to understand the nature of virtue. So have a beautiful day and catch you on the flip side.